They say every man has a soft spot, and in the case of Caleb Morrison, the loneliest cowboy in all of Texas, that spot would reveal itself on a night lit by lanterns to the sound of fiddles and dance moves. Those vast prairies, which knew only the trot of his horse, would soon witness the beating of a heart that until then he swore was dead inside. Caleb was not a man of sweet words or easy dreams. Life had hardened him like the leather of an old saddle. But that night, amidst flowing dresses and muffled laughter, he saw her, and the world, for a moment, seemed less heavy. Her name was Eleanor, or so they said. Her dress was sky blue, her hair tied in a flawless bun, her eyes held secrets like the desert holds the bones of those lost in it. She danced as if she didn't belong on that wooden floor, as if each step concealed a story. It was then that Caleb knew his life would never be the same. And like every good Wild West tale, fate would remind him that the more beautiful the lady, the sharper the blade she hides in her soul. Share this story to reach further. Subscribe to the channel, share this video on WhatsApp, and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. I'll be very happy to read each comment. And so begins this story, marked by dance steps, furtive glances, and a past that refuses to remain buried. Now follow me, because the first chapter has already been opened and the dust from the ballroom is still in the air. Caleb Morrison wasn't always a man of silence and dust. There was a time when his laugh was easy and hope lived in his eyes. He grew up in a log cabin on the outskirts of Abilene, amid the strong smell of leather and the sound of cows mooing in the distance. His father, an honest cowboy, was swallowed up by debt and disappeared during a merciless winter. His mother didn't survive long afterward, and so at 15, Caleb discovered that the world has no mercy on orphans. The weight of abandonment made Caleb a wanderer. With his faded hat and worn boots, he wandered from ranch to ranch, gathering what dignity he had between jobs. No one called him by his full name. He was just the boy. A boy who learned early that kindness could be a luxury too expensive to carry on the saddle. And the more he rode, the more his heart hardened, until one day he no longer knew what it was like to feel more than what was necessary to survive. At every stop, Caleb saw the small-town dances, but he never dared enter. The sound of the music, the swirling of skirts, and the female laughter were like a closed window he couldn't open. "This isn't the place for you," his hardened mind told him, until that night in Fort Worth, when an old friend insisted on taking him to the annual Grand Ball. Reluctantly, Caleb gave in. After all, what could he lose, other than a little more of the hope he no longer held? But what no one knew was that deep inside him, there was a hidden desire to belong, to dance too, even though his feet were more accustomed to the dust of the road than the polished floor of a ballroom. When he entered the ballroom of the Grand Hotel of Fort Worth, the smell of polished wood and cheap perfume invaded him disconcertingly. He was there. And for the first time, he wanted to be more than an outsider. That was when he first saw Eleanor, spinning like a living painting beneath the glow of the chandeliers. And something inside him, some half-forgotten instinct, whispered, "She doesn't belong here, just like you." Fort Worth breathed an almost palpable euphoria that night. The streets filled with tethered horses and carriages belonging to prominent families revealed that the Grand Ball was not just an event. It was a social ritual, a theater where everyone acted out the life they wanted. Caleb leaned against the doorframe, feeling out of place, like an intruder in a play whose script was unfamiliar. But his eyes didn't stray. They soon found Eleanor, the woman who danced unlike the others. She didn't laugh with her eyes like the city girls, nor were her steps light or disciplined. There was a fascinating disarray about her, a restrained sensuality that spilled over unintentionally. It was as if every turn she took screamed for freedom, but the blue dress and tight bun tried to trap a soul that had already been born free. It was hard for Caleb to resist the magnetism she exuded. For the first time, the cowboy crossed the room with hesitant steps, every click of spurs betraying a man out of place. But the truth was, his heart was pushing him more than his legs. When he finally approached, Eleanor noticed his fixed gaze and gave him a brief smile, almost a silent invitation. Caleb didn't know how to dance, but he knew how to rise to a challenge, and nothing seemed more challenging than this woman who danced as if she were hiding something. On impulse, he extended his hand, and to his surprise, she accepted. Their hands touched, and in that instant, the world seemed to shrink until it fit into the space between them. The music continued, but Caleb barely heard. The scent of her cheap perfume mingled with the aged wood, and her skin, though delicate, had the firmness of someone who wouldn't be easily dominated. Eleanor led the steps without realizing it, and the cowboy, lost in the whirlwind, understood there was more than beauty there. There was a story he needed to unravel. Her gaze was a constant invitation to uncover her secrets, but every smile she gave was like a door that closed immediately afterward. Caleb wanted to ask who she was, where she came from, but dance was the only language allowed that night, and in that language she was fluent like no other. As the song ended, Caleb realized his hand was still tightly gripping hers, as if afraid she would suddenly disappear. Eleanor looked him in the eye and said teasingly, "You dance like a cowboy who never wanted to dance. But I like it." It sounded like a tease, but also like a challenge. Caleb laughed, a short, husky laugh, and replied, "And you dance like someone who's danced in many places, but not in this ballroom." She didn't answer, just smiled, as if hiding an answer that shouldn't be said. As the ballroom spun with joy and song, Caleb realized there was more to this woman than a simple blue dress. Eleanor was an enigma, and the cowboy, unbeknownst to him, was already hooked. His long, silent heart began to pound. But what he didn't know was that her past danced alongside her, hidden beneath every step, every hip movement, every glance. And soon he would discover that the lady who fascinated him carried the echoes of a saloon in her veins. The night wore on, and curiosity burned in Caleb like the midday sun in the desert. He couldn't take his eyes off Eleanor. When she wasn't dancing, she was sitting at the table of a local senator, a banker, a promising young man. But she didn't seem to belong to any of them. There was a masked loneliness in her gestures, like someone smiling to hide a scream. Caleb watched from afar and wondered, who is this woman who dances with the body of someone who has already known the rough floor of a saloon, yet sits like a lady of respect? His doubts became greater than his own prudence. He knew that messing with mysterious women was like poking a sleeping snake, but his heart no longer listened to reason. In a more secluded corner, away from the main lights, Caleb found the courage to approach her again. She saw him coming, raised her punch glass and smiled, that same smile that said everything and nothing at the same time. "I didn't think a cowboy like you would know the way back," she teased. Caleb didn't like games, but something in him wanted to see it through to the end. "And I didn't think a lady like you could dance like a saloon girl," he replied firmly, but with a glint of curiosity in his eyes. She laughed, a brief laugh, but one that hid a hint of sadness. "Maybe because once I was one of them," she said softly, as if confessing a sin to the wind. That sentence stuck in Caleb's chest like a thorn. He couldn't tell if it was true or just another riddle, but something in her tone rang too real to be a joke. Eleanor looked away, as if she'd said more than she should. "But today I'm not anymore," she added, before the silence grew uncomfortable. Caleb felt a tightness in his chest. He wasn't a man to judge anyone's past. His own was a book with torn pages, but seeing this woman, so full of poise and elegance, reveal a saloon past disconcerted him. It was like discovering that the wine served in his glass was made from the same dirty barrel in the filthiest tavern. But before he could say anything, Eleanor stood and invited him into the back garden. "Come, I need some air. It's suffocating in here," she said. Outside, the black sky was like velvet, studded with stars, and the chill of the night enveloped them both. In the garden, surrounded by the scent of flowers and the distant sound of the ball, Eleanor opened up a little more. "No one here knows who I was, And maybe it's better this way, she confessed, her eyes lost in the sky. Caleb, unsure of what to say, simply watched. His heart wasn't sure if it was wise to move on or if it was already too late to turn back. He knew there was more to this woman, and he wanted every bit of that truth. And then, like someone planting a secret in a stranger's heart, Eleanor said, "Sometimes we dance beautifully to forget how many stumbles we've had in life." Caleb felt the weight of that sentence like a slowly tightening noose. And in that moment, he knew. She was a mystery he couldn't let go of. But every mystery has a price, and his was about to be exacted. The next day dawned heavy, as if the sky itself knew there were buried truths waiting to be unearthed. Caleb didn't return to his inn right away. He stayed in town, prowling the dirt streets and watching every corner as if waiting for answers the wind might bring. Something about Eleanor didn't fit. Her way of looking at the world, the way she occupied space, the steadiness in her eyes. These didn't come from birth or a refined upbringing. Caleb knew all too well the traits of survival, and Eleanor carried every one of them. And the more he thought, the more curiosity consumed him. He needed to know. He needed to see beyond that blue dress and that sophisticated bun. It was then, as he passed the door of an old, almost forgotten saloon in the city, that one of the retired pianists recognized him. "You were at the dance yesterday, weren't you? I saw you dancing with Eleanor," the old man said with a mischievous smile. Caleb stopped, his heart pounding in his chest. "What do you know about her?" he asked firmly. The old man laughed. "Her? Well, they didn't call her Eleanor before. Here she was known as Nellie. She danced every night on this wooden floor here. She was the star of the place before she suddenly disappeared." The words hit hard. Caleb felt the ground give way beneath his feet. Eleanor, Nellie, a saloon woman who now wore silk and pretended to be a lady. Anger and disillusionment mingled within him. He felt deceived, used, as if her every smile were just another trick learned on the hard life of a saloon stage. How could he, a man accustomed to the hardships of the road, have been swayed by a pair of eyes and a pretty dress? Caleb tried to push the thoughts away, but it was too late. The image of Eleanor twirling around the saloon now seemed like grotesque theater. Every step, every smile, was an echo of her past he hadn't wanted to see. Determined, Caleb returned to the hotel where he knew she was staying. He knocked loudly on the door, unsure of what he would say when she opened it. Eleanor appeared, still looking asleep, but her eyes widened at the sight of his expression. "You knew sooner or later someone would tell me, didn't you?" he said coldly, bluntly. She didn't feign surprise. She simply lowered her eyes, as if she had been waiting for this moment. "I didn't lie, Caleb. I just didn't tell," she replied in a tone of voice that mingled shame and defensiveness. But for him, omission was tantamount to betrayal. "And why this theatrics? Why pretend to be something you're not?" he roared, but his voice was more hurt than angry. Eleanor stared at him, her tears refusing to fall. "Because no one looks twice at a saloon woman. But everyone bows before a lady," she said, and those words hung in the air like a death sentence to any hope. Caleb left without another word. The streets seemed colder, the wind sharper. Something inside him had broken, and he didn't know if it was his pride or his heart. Caleb spent the next few days trying to forget, but the more he tried, the more Eleanor's image haunted him. The early mornings were filled with the imaginary sound of her footsteps in the ballroom, the smiles that now sounded like shams, the eyes he thought were sincere. But there was something worse than wounded pride. It was longing. As much as he wanted to hate her, his heart betrayed him with every beat, and when the heart doesn't forget, the body feels. Caleb felt the emptiness in his chest, a hole that no distance seemed to fill. Until one cloudy afternoon, as he was preparing his horse to leave town and never return, he heard a call behind him. It was Eleanor, without a blue dress, without a bun in her hair. Just a simple woman, dressed in a modest gown, her eyes swollen from crying. "Don't leave me like this, Caleb. Let me at least explain," she begged, her voice trembling. Caleb turned away, wanting to ignore her, but something inside him paralyzed him. "Explain what?" That I was just another one in your theater? He retorted dryly. But her tone wasn't that of an actress. It was that of someone tired of acting. Eleanor then approached, slowly, as if fearing a wild horse. I spent years dancing for coins, Caleb, watching men treat me like a thing, not a person. When I made enough money, I promised myself I'd start over, that no one would ever look at me as if I were worth less again. And then I went to the ball. I just wanted one night where I could be someone I'd never been, she confessed, her eyes welling up. Caleb listened, his chest tight. It wasn't anger she felt anymore, it was pain. The pain of realizing the world isn't just black and white. But why me? He asked in a whisper. Eleanor took a deep breath, her voice cracking. Because you looked at me differently. Not as a piece of furniture, but as someone worth discovering. I didn't plan anything, Caleb. I just wanted to be loved, even if only for one night. The silence that followed was thick, heavy as the sky before a storm. Caleb wanted to scream, wanted to get out of there, but he couldn't. There was a raw truth in those words, a truth that touched him more than he cared to admit. And there, in the middle of the dirt road, before that woman stripped of her masks, he understood. Eleanor wasn't just a lie. She was a woman trying to survive, like himself. And so, the lonely cowboy faced the choice that defines any man: turn his back on someone in need, or reach out to someone who's had to dance his whole life to stay afloat. Caleb said nothing, just held out his hand. And in that gesture, a glimmer of hope was rekindled. But the road to complete forgiveness would still be long. The following days were filled with heavy silence between Caleb and Eleanor. Even with the gesture of an outstretched hand, words remained absent, and eyes were always averted. Caleb tried to understand what he felt. It was more than disappointment. It was as if he had lost something he never had. Eleanor, for her part, maintained a respectful distance, but her presence was a constant, unspoken plea for forgiveness. Fort Worth seemed smaller, suffocating. The cowboy walked the dusty streets like a man divided. Part of him wanted to forget she existed. Another part wanted to hear more, understand more. But pride held him back like a barbed wire fence around his heart. One cloudy morning, Caleb saw her from afar, in the same saloon where she once danced as Nellie. Sitting alone on a broken chair, she stared at the empty stage as if staring at a tomb. The dust-covered piano, the abandoned tables. That scene was a mirror of her life. Something broke in Caleb. He couldn't bear to see anyone like that, even someone who had hurt him. Slowly, he approached and sat across from her. "Why did you come back here?" he asked, his voice low, almost a lament. Eleanor didn't look up. "Because I wanted to remember where I came from, to never forget who I am," he replied, a shy tear escaping her eye. Caleb had never been good with tears, especially not from others. But seeing Eleanor there, stripped of her ladylike costume, surrounded by the past that condemned her, was like a punch in the gut. "This place doesn't have to define you," he said, perhaps more to himself than to her. Eleanor laughed sadly. "You say that because you haven't lived here, Caleb. Every step I took on this stage was a coin dropped at my feet. Every smile, a weight I carry to this day." The cowboy wanted to tell her that she could change, that she could start over, but he knew that words couldn't change what the heart had already nailed as truth. The following days were a rehearsal for rapprochement. Caleb began seeing Eleanor in the same places, sometimes in silence, other times exchanging few words. But the truth was, he couldn't leave her behind. She was a mirror of what he himself felt, the desire to be seen beyond the scars. And so, slowly, the pain of disappointment began to mingle with something new, a feeling he couldn't even name, but which grew like a weed in a battered heart. One cold night, sitting on the porch of a boarding house, Eleanor finally said, "I don't know if I'll ever deserve your forgiveness, Caleb, but I want you to know you were the first man who made me want to be another woman." Those words echoed in his mind for days. And then Caleb understood it wasn't a matter of deserving. It was a matter of choice. And he had already chosen without realizing it. Time passed, and life in Fort Worth went on, but something had changed. Eleanor was no longer just a pretty face hiding behind a made-up name. She began working as a seamstress in the town, a humble but honest trade. Each stitch, each cut of fabric was a thread from the past that she sewed anew, trying to reshape her own story. The women of the town, initially suspicious, began to accept her skilled hands, not because they had forgotten who she had been, but because they saw that she truly wanted to be someone else, and that, in the Old West, was an act of courage. Caleb watched from afar, but pride could no longer keep him away. He saw in her a strength few possessed. It was easy to dance in the saloon for coins. It was hard to face the gaze of those who judged you and still move forward. One day, without warning, he showed up at the small sewing shop. "I need a patch on my shirt," he said with a shy smile. Eleanor looked at him and smiled back, a smile that mixed relief and hope. "I thought you didn't wear that shirt anymore," she joked. "I don't, but I think I need it to start over," he replied, letting out a look that said more than any words. The conversations resumed, the silences became less heavy. Caleb began taking her on walks out of town, to watch the sunsets on the prairies, to feel the free wind they both so desperately needed. With each conversation, a piece of the past was left behind. Eleanor was no longer Nellie, and Caleb was no longer the man who despised his own heart. Together, they found a place of complicity, where there was no judgment, only understanding. They knew the Old West was not forgiving, but the freedom they felt with each other was greater than any rumor. One spring afternoon, sitting by a river, Eleanor held Caleb's hand and said, "I'll never stop carrying who I was, but with you, I can be who I want to be." Caleb looked at her and for the first time felt that maybe this was what love was, accepting the other person completely, without erasing the scars. And then, without rushing, he kissed her. A simple kiss, but one that sealed a promise, that together they could forge a future, thread by thread, without fear of what people would say. Fort Worth still whispered stories about the saloon girl and the lonely cowboy, but they cared little, because in their hearts it no longer mattered what others saw, only what they were building with each other, and that was enough to start over. The months passed, and Fort Worth began to grow accustomed to the presence of this unlikely couple. The woman with a controversial past and the cowboy with a wounded soul walked together through the dusty streets with the serenity of those who had weathered worse storms. There were still suspicious glances, whispers in church aisles, and forced sighs at sewing circles, but there was also a respect that was beginning to blossom. Eleanor, with her firm posture and open heart, showed that redemption isn't something you ask for, it's something you build day by day. And Caleb, though a man of few words, demonstrated with every gesture that he had chosen to see her for who she was today, not for who she once was. It was a calm Sunday morning when Caleb, dressed in his best shirt, yes, the patched one, led Eleanor to the small chapel at the top of the hill. There were no flowers or celebrations, just the sound of the wind through the trees, and the old pastor waiting for them with a weary smile. "I want to start a new life with you, Nellie, or Eleanor, or whatever name you choose to bear," Caleb said, looking into her eyes. And she, with tears she this time didn't hide, replied, "You can call me yours." The ceremony was simple, almost silent, but every word exchanged carried the weight of a promise, not of perfection, but of companionship. And that, for two scarred hearts, was worth more than any solemn oath. After their wedding, they bought a small wooden house on the outskirts of town. Caleb returned to work in the stockyards, and Eleanor opened a larger sewing workshop where she taught other destitute girls how to earn a dignified living. She was now a symbol of strength, not shame. And the beautiful thing was that her transformation hadn't erased her past. On the contrary, it was the past that gave her the foundation to become who she was. Whenever she could, Eleanor spoke to the young women about choices, about resilience, and about never settling for less than they deserved. Caleb, in turn, watched with pride, a quiet but profound pride. Sometimes sitting on the porch, they would gaze at the horizon and talk about what was, what almost wasn't, and what they chose to be. "Do you remember the first dance?" she would ask with that mischievous smile. I remember the girl who danced as if she were escaping her own soul," he would reply with a look full of tenderness. "And now," she would tease, "now you dance because you know exactly who you are," he would reply, squeezing her hand. That was true love, made of stumbles, reunions, and a lot of forgiveness. Because in the end, the truth is this: we all have a saloon in our past. What changes is what we decide to build after we leave it. This story isn't about a lonely cowboy who found the perfect lady. It's about a broken man who allowed himself to love a woman who decided to change and found in her not only redemption, but also a new beginning. Caleb and Eleanor show us that not even the Wild West, with all its harshness, can stop two scarred souls from finding shelter in each other. Because true love is born from wounds, grows in empathy, and is sustained by the daily choice to stay, even when it would be easier to leave. If you've made it this far, I want to thank you for walking with me on this path of pain, overcoming, and love. This story was crafted with genuine emotion, and I hope it touched your heart as much as it touched mine. Maybe you've also had a difficult past, or know someone who deserves a new chance. If this story touched you, share it with someone. Send it on WhatsApp, tag a friend, and spread this message of hope. Subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and leave a like, because it helps me continue bringing you stories like this. And more than that, leave a comment. Where are you listening from? I'd love to hear how far this story has reached, and if any part of this narrative resonated with you, write to me. I'll read each comment with care. Don't forget to watch the channel's upcoming videos. There are many beautiful stories coming, stories that heal, inspire, and warm the heart. Thanks for listening, and until next time, where the Wild West breathes hope again.